So let me now move just to introduce the first session. We've called it COVID-19 Cultural Perspectives on a 21st Century Pandemic. And it's a little bit of an opportunity to, I think, step back from the immediacy of some of the issues around the pandemic, the number of deaths or testing capacities or what have you, and just give ourselves a little bit of space to try and understand the broader experiences of pandemic. How we interpret it, how we give it meaning, what are the main cultural trends that impact on the way that we understand it. To do that, I want to introduce Professor Frank Furedi. Frank's a renowned sociologist and social commentator. He's formerly Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent, Canterbury. He's the author of over 20 books, including a series that's been going for about more than 20 years now, a series of books on fear, starting in 1997 with Culture of Fear. Then Frank did a book on politics of fear. And in 2018, he did a book called How Fear Works, which I can show you here and urge you to go and purchase this book at the end, because it's really is worth a read. So, hello, Frank. Welcome. Thanks for coming. And over to you.
Well, I hope you can all hear me. Originally, I was going to talk a lot about the history of pandemics and the different reactions to it. But then I thought it'd be really quite useful to look at the main cultural drivers of what is distinct about our experience of dealing with a pandemic. What is distinct about our culture of fear in comparison to other human experiences. I think it's important to realize that the way a society reacts to a pandemic is principally defined by the cultural resources and values through which it makes sense of its everyday experience, and therefore the reactions are highly variable. So, for example, if you go back to the biggest pandemic of all in modern times, which was the Spanish flu that broke out in 1918, even though millions and millions of people died, I think estimates vary from 45 to 65 million people globally, the President of the United States, President Wilson, did not feel it necessary to even make a public comment on it. It was seen as a medical health problem, something you could outsource to your health specialist. And the way that people and societies responded in 1918 was very different than the way we react now, where virtually every single death that the media presents to us is seen in a very immediate, tangible way, as almost like reflecting on our own experience. I want to look at 6 important elements, important cultural drivers, which I think has come into play over the last couple of months in the way that the pandemic is generally experienced. I think the most important cultural variable that I find is that one of the distinguishing features of our world is that the world finds it very, very difficult, unusually difficult for modern times, to deal with uncertainty. Uncertainty is really about understanding how things will pan out in the future. Uncertainty is basically a domain of the unknown to which we try to apply our creativity, our knowledge, to try to capture it, to try to understand it. And if you look back in history, you'll find that the more creative a society is, the better they are at dealing with uncertainty. So to give you a couple of historical examples, ancient Athens, where democracy was born, was one of the most risk-taking communities in the world. It went out all over the world in ships. It kind of established colonies throughout the Mediterranean. It invented democracy and science. And I think in a very real sense, its appreciation of freedom was very much bound up with its capacity to regard uncertainty as not just as a problem, but as an opportunity for making things happen. I think you'll find a very similar dynamic at play during the Renaissance, where in the Renaissance period, the idea of daring to make things happen, of going out, again, of going all over the world and opening up the world to knowledge and cultivating knowledge, to do things that were never done before, was very highly valued. And I think, you can see there where uncertainty is taken in a very positive, serious kind of a way. I think in our world, one of the things that has, in a sense, been around for the last 2 or 3 decades is that in the Western world in particular, but now also in Asia, we increasingly regard uncertainty in a very one-sided way as entirely negative. There's nothing good about uncertainty. We no longer think that uncertainty is a buzz, something that might motivate us, inspire us to make things happen. Instead, uncertainty is always seen in a very negative way. And in fact, if you look at the way that discussions have been going for some time, but certainly today, uncertainty has become a synonym with danger. By definition, it's seen as a dangerous phenomenon rather than anything else. And I think that if we regard uncertainty in that kind of negative dystopian way, what we are really saying is that our view of the future is one-sidedly one where we feel a little bit paralyzed, we feel anxious, and we become very, very alarmist. And I think that sense of alarmism is really very, very important. And in this pandemic, one of the symptoms of the difficulty that we have in dealing with uncertainty is that we have gotten to the position where whenever we talk about the pandemic, worst case scenarios are invariably projected as the norm. So we don't talk about worst case scenarios as an extreme possibility, which is important to work out just in case bad things happen that we never expected. We basically take worst case scenarios as the basis on which we act, as the basis on which we make decisions about the way we kind of make our way in this world. And therefore, when you have worst case scenarios, what you have is this philosophy that more or less imagines that things will get as bad as it can get, as bad as it can get. And therefore, when you have worst case scenarios as the norm, it kind of narrows opportunities. It kind of limits us from taking risk. I think the reaction to Sweden is very interesting in this, because whatever you think about what the Swedes are doing in this pandemic, the very fact that they're doing something different, that they're making choices about the way they're going to handle the emergency, is almost seen as ipso facto a bad thing, a negative thing, because somehow they kind of veered away from our worst case scenarios and moved into a different world. For me, I think the main problem with this kind of management of uncertainty in this negative way is that it creates a very fatalistic cultural atmosphere. We basically have a very fatalistic sense that there's something out there. These things are going out there, and we either have to suffer it, live with it, or try to minimize its kind of destructive effects without thinking of opportunities or ways and means of overcoming aspect of it, and in a sense giving a far greater scope to our power of imagination and creativity. So I think that's the first important cultural driver. I think that's quite important. The second cultural element in this pandemic, which has been around again for some time, but you can see it everywhere in the way that we exist, is what I call precautionary thinking. Precautionary thinking basically means what my grandmother used to say whenever I got into trouble. He would say, "Better safe than sorry, Frank." The idea is that it's far better to play it safe than to take risks, to try new things out. It basically means the sanctification of safety, where safety itself becomes this value to the point at which people are worried about the fact that you and I might go out into the fresh air and walk around in the beautiful sunshine and thereby make the situation worse. Whereas we know, in fact, from all the existing epidemiological evidence that if I go outside into the fresh air, walk around, keep a bit of distance from you, then the chances of anybody getting infected by this virus are next to nil. But we cannot basically say, well, let's use common sense and go outdoors and enjoy this beautiful weekend. We say, stay safe. And the number of times you hear this echoed, stay safe, it almost becomes this quasi-religious sort of dogma that is being repeated time and time again. And again, precautionary thinking discourages us from using our initiative and discourages us from thinking different ways of responding to our experience and learning from that. The third important cultural driver that I think is really, really quite important is the way that we view human beings. You know, one of the issues that we have to kind of think about when we look at a pandemic or a disaster, a catastrophe, and our response to it is, what can we do as human beings? And our response to a disaster depends upon our version of what a human being is all about. In sociology and psychology, we call that our definition of personhood. What is a person? Now, in some societies, we think of people, a person, as somebody that can deal with distress. We think that people ought to be able to take a bit of pain now and again. We think that maybe having a few adverse experiences may actually teach you something, may toughen you up. We think that sometimes letting people out without their parents kind of hovering over them or without their line manager micromanaging them is on balance a good thing, because even if they make mistakes, even if they burn their fingers through an experience, they will learn something. So some societies will encourage people to kind of try things out. And that's based upon the fact that, you know, we think that human beings are able to rise to a challenge, are able to deal with difficulties. Other versions of personhood basically are much more skeptical about this. They think that children in particular, young people, should not be expected to be criticized. They should not be expected to deal with failure. They should not be expected to put up with too much pain. It's often argued in some circumstances that people who experience distress and pain, especially when they are young, are going to be, use the expression, damaged for life, or they're going to become scarred for life. And the point I'm really getting at is that we have versions of personhood that range from a definition of a person as by and large resilient, adaptable, and flexible, on the one hand, to a definition of personhood that defines a person as somebody that's intrinsically, inherently vulnerable. If you can imagine a continuum from resilience on the one side, a resilient person on one side, to vulnerable person on the other side of the continuum, at the other end, right? If you can imagine that, I think that our society, again, particularly in the Anglo-American world, but more broadly in the Western world, is very much oriented towards seeing people as being defined by their vulnerability. And if the number of times you will hear the word vulnerable during this pandemic is actually quite interesting. I mean, we no longer simply refer to the over 70-year-olds or people that have chronic illnesses. It tends to become more expansively used all the time. And if you think that people are defined by their vulnerability, if you basically underestimate their capacity to deal with adversity, then the very meaning of that adversity will be very, very different than if it's seen quite different. You see, you have to remember that historically, societies that had a robust idea of personhood, that really believed in people being able to deal with stuff, adapted fantastically. You probably heard about the bombing of Hiroshima, right? A horrible thing, nuclear weapons dropped on a Japanese city. What people don't realize is that a week after Hiroshima was bombed and thousands of people were killed by that experience, a week after that, Hiroshima was back at work. The shipyards were working, people were going to work. They were asking questions, what is this invisible bomb that killed so many of us? But by and large, it was a remarkable turnaround in a week. The bombing of Hamburg, where again, it was a massive bombing that took place against the Germans in Hamburg, where again, tens of thousands of people were killed. The whole city was devastated. 3 days after the bombing of Hamburg, life went back to normal. But we today, given our definition of vulnerability, find it almost impossible to conceptualize. How could that happen? How could you recover after such a tragic event? And I think the differential response depends upon what we think people are capable, because if we think people are resilient, then most of us will rise to the challenge and we will behave in a resilient way. But if on the other hand, we're medicalized and told that by staying indoors and social distancing, we're going to have mental health problems, I can assure you that in our state of vulnerability, we will play the role that is assigned to us, and we will begin to feel disoriented and distressed. So I think that's, to me, is really quite important. And it's in many respects, one of the most distressing feature of our cultural script about what a pandemic is. The fourth element that's really quite important is the growing tendency by policymakers to infantilize the public. We do tend to treat people as if they were biologically mature children, as if they really cannot be expected to behave like grown-up and adults. And I think it's very, very interesting that in this pandemic, the media led the way. If you look at the first week when the whole pandemic became real in the United Kingdom, the constant refrain in the media was, the government, please do something. What are you going to do? What action are you going to take? And the other side of the coin of demanding that something must be done by the government is that we, the people, cannot be expected to do anything on our own. We need government to hold our hand. We need basically governments to almost look after us in the way that mommy and daddy does when we're 2-year-old. And at times, I felt like we were in the middle of a Hobbesian thought experiment. I don't know if any of you studied Thomas Hobbes, but he's the famous English 17th century philosopher who basically argued that if an absolutist sovereign, guarantees to protect the people in return will give over their freedom freely, because people are so concerned with being protected that they will give up their freedom in exchange for this. And it was almost as if we're telling the government, the media was imploring the government, lock us down. I remember the press conference with Boris Johnson, and the media criticized, Boris, why don't you instruct us, tell us to be quarantined in our homes? So there's this kind of sense where the public is regarded in an infantilized way, where we somehow are seen not to have the capacity for responsible behavior, to make choices, sensible choices, in circumstances such as this. The fifth, I think, really interesting cultural feature of our times is the development of the ideology of survivalism. And what survivalism really means is that, what it says, it's about survivalism becoming an end in itself. That somehow we are so obsessed with our well-being, with kind of surviving, with regarding almost every single problem as a question of survival, that we tend to inflate threats. We tend to see problems where perhaps there aren't any problems. We find it difficult to think in the language of solutions. And all the time, from the standpoint of survivalism, we tend to think about just about anything that has cropped up as a threat, immediately as a threat. And not only do we see it as a threat, but we tend to inflate that threat all the time. And one symptom of this is that We've developed this capacity for big numbers. We cannot imagine that the number of people dying in this pandemic will be large, very large, but not anywhere in the range that it's predicted. We've kind of began by talking about 250,000 people dying in Britain. Now we're kind of ratcheting it down more and more. But that kind of survivalist, temptation of seeing things in a kind of inflated kind of a way is really, really quite important. And one of the downsides of a survivalist ideology is that we become completely dominated by this idea that there has to be a trade-off between survival and security on the one hand, and freedom and democracy on the other hand. That somehow we have to give up our freedoms, particularly our individual freedoms, in order to make society more secure. It sounds very tempting. It's like an obvious one or the other. But actually, the thing that we learn from history is that the best way of dealing with adversity and with challenges is not by becoming slaves or unfree. It's precisely when citizens are able to act freely, make judgments, and act in accordance with their judgment and choices, that they become in a position where they find it they find that they can create a situation where genuine solidarity can be forged by people using their freedom in a kind of creative way. And it seems to me that one of the things that we forget when we trade in freedom for security is that in our world, freedom needs to be a first order principle. It's not something that we can just give away and expect that it will come back tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It's something that represents a very significant aspect of our future. Finally, something that perhaps you'd like to discuss, not just here, but in the other session, what I think is the sixth element in our cultural script of the pandemic is this. I think that ideology aside and political differences aside, because this is something that permeates the entire political class, it permeates our political culture and our everyday life. I think really we are dominated today by a very powerful mood of presentism. We have for some times regarded the present moment as a kind of safe space within which we should find refuge. So what does that mean? Well, what presentism refers to is that to some extent, we become switched off from the past. We have for some times found the past an alien territory. We often have come to the conclusion that the legacy of the past has very little to teach us. We, instead of talking about the good old days, tend to talk about the bad old days. We kind of regard the past as an alien territory. And we've become to some extent unable to use creatively the legacy of human achievements. So we kind of switched off from the past. That doesn't give us any inspiration or very much strength. But at the same time, we're also estranged from the future. Because whenever we think of the future, particularly the future of uncertainty, we tend to have adopted a very dystopian negative view of what the future will look like. And one of the things that has happened is that whenever you watch a Hollywood film or read a book about the future, invariably the future looks very bleak. It looks very negative. I have never seen a Hollywood film or a Netflix production in recent decades where happy people are smiling in the future and where the future is seen as a better version of the world than the present. It's always worse, always very, very bleak. So what's happened is that we've become somehow stuck in between the present and the future. We're living in this kind of very presentist moment. And when you live in this presentist moment and you have got no perspective either on the past and on the future, you do develop a highly conservative a highly risk-averse, survivalist mode of dealing with stuff. And I think that this is particularly important because what we should be doing now, this very moment, is not just responding to the immediate threat of the pandemic. What we need to do is begin to discuss what the world will be like in the post-disaster phase of this epidemic. We need to discuss those things because unless we begin to project our imagination and our aspiration into the future, argue and debate about it, we will be wasting a tremendous opportunity for making something positive come out of this very negative, distressing moment in our lives. Thank you.